co-host now, so you see the beeping when people enter the room. No one else can hear that.
People are still joining. Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and start? Henry, if you want to go ahead and start the recording.
Start it.
Okay, great. So let's, thanks everyone for coming. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for creating us in your image. We thank you, Lord, for giving us the gift of language. We thank you for this time we have to study your word and the world that you've created. Give us wisdom and guidance and enable us to think the way you think. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thanks for attending. Again, this is the 12th and final week of our study on evolution. We've covered a lot of ground. We spent a lot of time talking about the logical inconsistencies of what people call macroevolution or upward evolution. We've talked about the impossibility of creating complexity from natural processes. We've talked about the inability of the story of evolution to explain the origin of things, where things came from. We've talked about the limits of science. We spent a lot of time talking about the earth and how the flood reshaped the earth. And we talked about animals and the fossil record. And then this is our final week in which we're going to talk about man. And in particular, we have three topics under that subheading, three topics under that heading that we're going to cover today. The first is we're going to talk about human genetics. And woven in here, we're also going to talk a little bit about history. So human genetics and history to try to understand how long have humans been around. From the scientific point of view, from the evidence point of view. The second is we're going to briefly look at humanoid fossils, and we're going to try to answer the question, how similar are we to chimps and apes and these other animals with whom we are supposed to have a common ancestor? So how much evidence is there really to support that idea? And then the third thing we're going to talk about, and we're going to spend probably about half our time or so on this. We're going to spend a lot of time on the origin of language. Where did language come from? And I'll present a thesis, and I'll try to provide some evidence to support that thesis as we go. So these are the three main topics. Let's start with genetics and human history to determine how long have humans been around.
Stan,
so, yes.
Are you sharing your screen?
I'm not either. I've neglected to do that. Thank you, Henry, for reminding me. Let's see. Okay. Share screen.
We can see it now.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thanks everyone for your patience. Okay, so we're in week 12, and these are the three topics that we're going to cover today that I just mentioned. Okay, human genetics, humanoid fossils, and the origin of language. So the first question we want to answer is, how long have humans been around on Earth according to the data that is that's available to us? So we know from the scriptures that Noah and his family left the ark. So they were on the ark for about a year. They left the ark, and then they repopulated the earth. So Noah's sons had sons who had sons and daughters. They repopulated the earth. Some number of generations later, they disobeyed God's command, which was to fill the earth, and instead they congregated together in one place. They built a city and Tower of Babel in rebellion against God, and as a result, God dispersed them. God dispersed them by confusing their languages. Now, all this occurred in Babel, so we should expect the earliest traces of mankind to be somewhere in or around Babel, and that is indeed what we find. So Noah had three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The location of Babel is at the intersection of three continents. At the risk of oversimplifying, Japheth and his descendants went sort of north toward Europe. Ham and his descendants went south toward Africa. And Shem and his descendants went east toward Asia. And then in the Middle East region, you have a lot of overlap. And again, that's oversimplification, so because things change over time. But what's interesting is we do have a record in Genesis 10. It's called the Table of Nations. This has to be one of the most amazing pieces of ancient literature. It's unique in that it very succinctly categorizes the ancestry of the human race, tracing back to Noah. And even today, you can trace the names of those, you can trace many of the names in that table of nations with the cities, the rivers, and the countries in that surrounding area, where people, as they went, they named things after themselves, they named things after their sons, and so forth. And there is a fairly compelling record in history. Some of those names survive today, some of them are historical, but you can compare those names with the names in the Bible and get a somewhat, I wouldn't say it's a complete record, but you can get a fairly detailed picture of where people went and where they settled and so forth. Okay. It is a matter of historical record that all the ancient civilizations are near Babel. Okay. So when archaeologists dig up ancient civilizations, they're all in or around Babel. And until recently, the model of human history that was taught, I say recently, I mean, as of maybe like 20 or 30 years ago, it was the Fertile Crescent. So the Fertile Crescent is this crescent-shaped piece of land that includes Israel or Palestine, and then curves around to Mesopotamia. And the idea was that ancient civilizations are all found in this Fertile Crescent, including the Sumerians, the Akkadians, and so forth. And that's what was taught for a long time. Lately, however, there's been this out of Africa story. And so the modern view is that humans originated in sub-Saharan Africa and then populated the earth from there. And there are two reasons for believing this. One is that Darwin himself argued that humans are related to apes. And so that gives, I guess, some reason to believe that we came from Africa, but that's not a very strong reason. The stronger reason is that genetics shows that when you look at the human genome, people who live in Africa today have more genetic diversity than people who live in other places. And so because of that greater diversity, the argument is that they must therefore be closer to the origins of humans. But that's basically the only argument there is that I'm aware of to support that story. The historical record, all the archaeological data and so forth, all support Mesopotamia as the origin. Mesopotamia being the right-hand curve, part of that Fertile Crescent curve, as the origin of mankind, right? Which is what the Bible teaches. And then there's some interesting recent research where they took some Egyptian mummies from a long time ago, and they compared their DNA with DNA of other locations, and they concluded that the ancient Egyptians were actually more similar to people who lived in the Near East, Palestine and Turkey in particular, than they were to people in Africa. And this is despite the fact that Egypt is in North Africa itself. And they concluded also that the sub-Saharan mixture of modern Egyptian DNA is actually a more recent thing. It wasn't there at the beginning. And so this, again, lends further evidence to what I'm saying, that the origin of mankind really is in that Fertile Crescent Mesopotamian region near Babel. If we look at the timeline, again, looking at what secular historians say, the estimation of absolute dates becomes possible in the second half of the third millennium BC. So the third millennium is 2000 to 3000 BC. Halfway through that would be 2500. And so what they're saying is that beyond 2500, we can't establish any absolute dates. And then if we start looking at ancient civilizations, the Sumerians, for example, go back to about 2600 BC. And so they have the Sumerian king list. It lists all the kings before the flood. Then the flood swept over. Then they list the kings after the flood. In India, the Indus Valley civilization is one of the oldest civilizations. It goes back to about the same time period. The Assyrians go back to about 2400 BC. The Akkadians, 2300. There's the Uruk Chronicle, which lists the kings of Sumer, and it goes back to about 2100 BC. China has an ancient civilization. It goes back again about 2100. The Babylonians are just a little bit more recent in terms of the evidence that we have. The only exception that I'm aware of for ancient civilizations really is Egypt. Egypt's chronology is problematic. There's a man named David Roll who has studied this and proposed an alternate, what he calls a new chronology. And this new chronology, the argument is that the Egyptians didn't do a very good job of keeping records, and their chronology has unfortunately been used to date the other civilizations at this older time, and that's kind of putting the cart before the horse, because the Egyptian record is the worst. And so he instead turns it around and uses the other records to date the Egyptians, and then brings the Egyptian dates down. So bottom line is, I think there's good reason to not trust the Egyptian dates. And so when they say the Egyptian pyramids were built in like 3000 BC or 3500 BC, I think there's good reason to doubt that. We don't have time to go into that. I'll just leave that as an exception. The point is that the historical record is fairly consistent, and that all of the hard evidence for the dates of ancient civilizations goes back to about the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. Okay. Now, if you asked an evolutionist or a mainstream historian, they wouldn't say that this is the beginning of these civilizations. They would say they extend beyond that because of various assumptions and so forth. But the hard data really lands you here. What's curious is if you look at the Bible and count up the dates, Noah leaves the ark in 2347 BC, right? So that's an exact date, but there are some assumptions behind it. So give or take maybe 50 years or 100 years is probably about the largest margin of error there, depending on what assumptions you apply. And so this is surprisingly consistent, I would say, with the historical record. And it gives us further reason to strengthen our faith in the accuracy of the scriptures. Okay, so that's the historical record. Let's look at human genetics now. So the human body has trillions of cells. Each of these cells has a nucleus, and inside the nucleus is DNA. DNA is a computer program, and that computer program tells us how to build our body and how to maintain our body, right? So as a baby, as the baby's growing, and all the internal organs and so forth are all constructed using instructions in the DNA. And then if you get sick or you get hurt or you're trying to digest food or whatever, this is all done using the DNA. I mean, the DNA creates these proteins that then is used to create the proteins that then allows life to function. Okay. So you have 23 pairs of chromosomes in your body. You get 23 from your mom and 23 from your dad. That's where you get the 23 pairs. And then one of these 23, one of them determines your sex, whether you're male or female. So your mom has XX and the dad has XY. And this gives 4 possibilities for a baby, right? So the baby can be either XX or XY, but there are 2 versions of each of those, depending on which of the X chromosomes they took from the mom and which of the chromosomes they took from the dad. The key point to note here is that the boy gets the Y chromosome from the dad. So, and that dad got his Y chromosome from his dad, who got it from his dad. So the Y chromosome is passed down from father to son to grandson, all the way down. Any male living today can trace their Y chromosome back to Adam. So here we have Adam and Eve. Adam has a Y chromosome, which he passes to his son, who passes it to his son, and so forth, all the way down to Noah. And Noah then passes it to 3 sons. And then all the males alive today can trace their Y chromosome back to one of these 3 sons. Exactly. And so this Y chromosome is powerful evidence then that can be used by geneticists to try to understand the history of the male part, at least, of the human race all the way back to the beginning. Over time, there are mutations that occur. So what'll happen is, as the DNA is being passed from the father to the son, there's some probability that there'll be a mutation. It's not very often, but sometimes it happens. When that happens, then that mutation that gets passed down from that person to the next person. And so the scientists can then study these mutations and use them to reconstruct sort of the history of life. Similarly, there's something called mitochondrial DNA. So mitochondrial DNA is not in the nucleus, and it's passed from mother to daughter. So in the same way that Y chromosomal DNA is passed from father to son, Eve passed this down to all 3 of Noah's son's wives, his daughters-in-law, and then from those he passed it down. They passed it down to all the females alive today. So every female alive today can trace her mitochondrial DNA back to one of these 3 women, and then ultimately back to Eve herself. So geneticists have defined this thing called the most recent common ancestor. This is the person from whom all living persons today descend, the most recent person from whom all living persons today descend. So we can look at male and female. So they define something called the Y-chromosomal atom. So they don't associate this with the biblical Adam. They just use the name Adam to refer to this person. So this is the most recent common ancestor of all males. He lived about 200,000 years ago, according to their estimates. And we would say this is Noah, right? So Noah passed his Y chromosomes to his 3 sons. All males today can trace their Y chromosomes back to Noah. They also have postulated this mitochondrial Eve. She's the most recent common ancestor of all females. She also lived about 200,000 years ago. These are approximate dates, even in their mind. And we would say that this is actually Eve, right? So again, Noah's sons' wives don't trace their mitochondrial DNA back to Noah's wife. They trace it back to their mothers, right? And so you have to go all the way back to Eve to find the most recent common ancestor of all females. Hope that's clear. These dates of 200,000 years, they're based on assumed mutation rates. But it was recently discovered, when I say recently, it was actually 20 years ago. In 1998, it was discovered that as geneticists got more and more data, as they studied the genome more carefully, and they looked at it, they discovered that the mutation rate was actually 20 times faster than they previously thought. So their original dates were based on evolutionary assumptions, similarity of, so they have this timeline that they've already constructed that describes human evolution over time from some ape-like ancestor. They used that assumption to give them a mutation rate, use that mutation rate to calculate the 200,000 years. But when they actually looked at the data, they found that it was 20 times faster. So 20 times faster is the difference in weighing 200 pounds and 4,000 pounds, right? This is a huge difference. And quote, such a high mutation rate would indicate that Eve lived about 6,500 years ago, a figure clearly incompatible with the current theories on human origins. So this is in the paper itself from one of the scientists who led the study. And then another quote, another article, evolutionists are most concerned about the effect of a faster mutation rate. Using the new clock, she, that is mitochondrial Eve, would be a mere 6,000 years old. 6,000 years old is the equivalent of 4,000 BC. 4,000 BC puts you almost exactly at the date that the Bible says Adam and Eve lived. And then there are other studies that also calculate the most recent common ancestor to be a few thousand years ago. So this is a huge problem for evolutionists, right? So the data itself tells them that humans trace their origins back to a woman who lived only a few thousand years ago. Unfortunately, so here's where we run up against the problem of paradigms. So when you have bought into a paradigm, you will, scientists oftentimes, historically this is true, and I think it's true today, will maintain that paradigm despite the data. So we have this naive view that science is about discovering data and then using the data to, and following the data wherever it leads. In practice, what tends to happen is scientists look at data and then try to fit that data into the existing paradigm. And so they come up with ways to explain the data away rather than finding ways to modify their paradigm to adjust to the hard data that's staring them in the face. So even though this is 20 years old, obviously this didn't change anyone's view in the mainstream scientific community. They're still holding fast to millions of years and hundreds of thousands of years for humans. But nevertheless, here's the data. So we talked about most recent common ancestor. There's also something called the identical ancestors point. And this is the time in history when all people that were alive then are either ancestors of all living people today, or they have no living descendants. And by definition, this IPA is older than the most recent common ancestor. So the IPA is really Adam and Eve. So if you go back to Adam and Eve, when Adam and Eve were alive, all those people who were alive then, Adam and Eve, are either the ancestors of all people alive today, or they have no living descendants. So I guess I should clarify. From the biblical point of view, and with some mild assumptions, the IPA would be Adam and Eve. So you can imagine scenarios in which, hypothetically, in which this is not the case. But for example, if they had, let's say Adam and Eve had 2 children and one of them died with no descendants, then that other child, not 2 children. So they had a number of children and one of those children died, then I guess you could, and all the other children. This is complicated, okay? it's tough to wrap your head around this. The point I'm trying to make is that evolutionists, when they look at these definitions, the definitions don't necessarily lead to Adam and Eve or to Eve and Noah in the other case. What I'm saying is that from a biblical point of view, that's, I think, the most reasonable way to interpret this data. Nevertheless, what is interesting is that unlike the most recent common ancestor, the IPA considers both parents. And so therefore it has the potential to give more accuracy. And there are several studies that have found that the IPA is actually a few thousand years ago. So there was a paper in Nature in 2004 that modeled the recent common ancestry of all living humans. You can see the link there, and you can double check these references on your own. There was another unpublished paper that argued that the most recent common ancestor with both parents, treating both parents. So these concepts are very closely related, the IPA and the most recent common ancestor. But in this other paper, it argues, excuse me, that that our heritage goes back less than 5,000 years. And then there's another published study that says today, if you take any two random Europeans, just take two Europeans at random, and then look at their DNA, you will find with a high degree of certainty that their ancestors are shared within the last 2,500 years. So that's fairly recent, right? 2,500 years takes you to 500 BC, which is actually pretty recent. And that's among Europeans alone. So these data are fairly consistent. We should be careful that none of this proves the biblical timeline, but it's certainly consistent with it. It's also consistent with evolution if you're willing to sort of suspend disbelief, right? So there's nothing in here that disproves evolution, but it certainly isn't what they expected, right? It certainly wasn't what was predicted by their model, and to fit it within their model requires some storytelling, some creativity. So I think we can be encouraged that not only from the historical point of view that we just saw, but also from the genetic point of view, there's a substantial amount of data that again corroborates the story recorded in the scriptures. Okay, so that's the first part of the talk, talking about history and genetics, trying to understand how old is the human race. And we've seen, from multiple lines of evidence that the evidence is consistent. Now, the second part of the talk is looking at the fossil record to try to understand how similar are we actually to, say, chimps and apes? How much evidence is there to support this evolutionary story of common ancestry? So the word on the street is that humans share about 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees. Okay, this is very commonly popular view that's held by people. The number comes from a 1975 study, which is quite a number of years ago. This was long before genomes were sequenced. There wasn't enough data at that time to say, but based on some assumptions, they came up with this number that they predicted. By 2005, scientists had actually sequenced the genome, and this is the most widely cited study. If you actually look at the study itself, it found that there was about a 1% difference from substituting letters in the DNA code. And there was an additional 3% difference from insertion and deletions of portions of the DNA code. And so that study concluded that we're 96% the same as chimpanzees. So this is the most generous number that evolutionists could come up with that is based on data. So the 99% is just basically a myth. This is known as the myth of 1%. There's no data behind it at all. The 96% number is actually supported by data, but even that is not without controversy. So it turns out it's not that straightforward to compute. So some people who are in some of the creationist literature, and then some other people who have just argued online by looking at the data and going through it in detail, have argued that the similarity between humans and chimps DNA is really in the 80%. So 81 to 87% is a more realistic number. So we we won't have time to to do this, to go over this in detail, but this is nevertheless the record. So maximum of 96, but probably more like 85 or so. Now there are quite a few surprises here that scientists have found. So the human and chimp Y chromosome. So we talked about Y chromosomes before. Remember, Y chromosomes is part of the DNA. When the 2005 study studied the similarity of the DNAs to calculate that 96% similarity, they did the best they could with the data they had, but they didn't study everything because it's not all there. It's not so straightforward. If you look at the Y chromosomes, in later studies, they discovered that, so they expected, because the rest of the DNA was so similar, they expected when they came to the Y chromosome that they would also be very, very similar. What they found instead that they're actually 30% different. And one of the leading scientists of that study said, quote, they're horrendously different from each other. Now, when you think about it, why is he applying the word horrendously to this data? He's applying a moral attribute to data that doesn't have a moral character to it. So why is he doing that? What he's really saying, I think, is that the data is so out of line with the prediction of the model that scientists are not happy with it, right? And they would prefer to have data that fit their model, but it doesn't. And so it's not just different from each other, it's horrendously different. Why? Because it calls into question the model. That, I think, is the unspoken sort of assumption behind that choice of word. The chimp has, within this 30% of difference, we could say more things. For example, the chimp has has less than half, so 47% of the same protein coding elements as humans. Okay, so again, showing you that there is more difference between chimps and humans that was previously realized. If you look at the data, that paper is 2010. So the earlier paper that said 96% was 2005. So this is more recent data that helps to clarify the similarity between these different types of beings. There's another study back in 97 that looked at chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas and showed that they differ significantly from each other. The point being, if these different creatures differ significantly from each other, more than if the variation between these species is greater than the variation within the species, then it provides, it makes it harder to argue that they have a common ancestor. So if chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas may not have a common ancestor, which is the conclusion I think this data sort of points to, how much more so then is it unlikely that the chimpanzees and the humans have a common ancestor? And then some more surprises. The evolutionary story is that as we go back in time, or as we dig deeper in the rock layers, we'll get simpler and simpler organisms. And these simpler organisms were just kind of like blobs of life that then evolved over time into more and more complex creatures. What scientists have been discovering as they've continued to get more data is that these very simple organisms have surprisingly complex genomes. The humans, for example, were originally thought to have many more genes than they actually do. As the data came in, that number had to be decreased down to the present number, which is about 20,500 genes is the number of genes in a human genome. And you can see that from that, if you can read that title there, it says human gene count tumbles again. So back in 2008, this was the perception, was that we're having to bring that number down. Simultaneously, when we looked at, when scientists looked at simple organisms like the nematode, which is a roundworm, it has 20,000 genes. So this is about the same number as a human, surprisingly, right? So this is not a simple organism from a genetic point of view. And even the sponge has 18,000 genes, which is only about 10% less than the human. And the sponge lives in the is found in the Precambrian rock. So if you remember our study of the fossil record, there's something called the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion is that boundary in the lower rock layers between the very, very, very simple, like bacteria and so forth, recorded in the rock, and then below, and then the large amount of different species and phyla of different types of animals and plants that are found above the Cambrian explosion. that just sort of appear out of nowhere without any clear ancestry. So this amazing complexity of life occurs at the Cambrian explosion. This data shows that that complexity actually appears in the fossil record lower than the Cambrian explosion. So even in the Precambrian rock, we have things like sponges that have genetic material that's almost as complex as a human. And this genetic material codes for things like muscle tissue and that sort of thing. It's enormously complex. There's no way in the evolutionary story to explain where this complexity comes from. And then curiously, it turns out that human and the genes between humans and sponges are actually about 70% the same or 30% different. So, at the top of the page, you can see that the Y chromosomes from humans and chimps are 30% different. Well, humans and sponges are also 30% different. So if we're really 85% similar to chimps and 70% similar to sponges, what does that actually say? I think an evolutionist would probably say, well, we are, that similarity shows a common ancestry. But I think, excuse me, I think what this shows is really that the expectation of the evolutionary story is not found in the actual data itself. Our similarity with all these other organisms is much greater than you would expect, and the similarity with chimps is much less than you would expect. And therefore, I think what this points to is that at creation, God put the genetic code into these, into all the different types of life, as a computer programmer would put code into a computer, and then the microevolution or the lateral evolution took over from there. So at some point we talked about the sole evidence for evolution is homology. Okay, there's one piece of evidence, there's one piece of really good evidence for evolution, and that is homology. Homology is this idea that we can look at two different organisms, and if they look similar, we can conclude that they might have a common ancestor. So I can look at a Chihuahua and I can look at a Great Dane, and even though they might be different sizes and so forth, they both have lots of dog characteristics, and so I can conclude that they have a common ancestor. And I can not just guess at that, but I can show it through interbreeding of these different types of dogs. When we look at the fossil record, so another piece of evidence that evolutionists try to use to support their story is the fossil record. Last week we looked at the evolution of whales, and it turns out that when they're looking at the fossil record, what they're actually doing is applying the same argument of homology. So it really all comes back to homology again. So there's two different fossils that they find in the rock. They look at the two fossils and convince themselves that they look similar enough that they must have a common ancestry, right? Say with whales. So the same thing happens with humans. They dig up bones and then compare these bones and say, well, these bones look similar to each other, therefore there must be a common ancestry. It really all ties back to homology. The problem with homology is when I look at two things, it's possible to properly infer common ancestry, like with two different dogs, but it's also possible to improperly infer common ancestry. And so people have made the argument that if I look at, say, a car and a motorcycle, they look similar, they have wheels, they move, but they don't have a common ancestry. They were designed for their different functions. And so homology really is speculation. Now, if we go to the humanoid fossils, so we look at what kind of fossils have been used over history to justify this link between humans and non-humans. We'll just go through them briefly. So the Java man was found in 1892. It consists of a single tooth, part of a skull, so the skull cap, and a thigh bone that were some number of feet from each other. That was the evidence that was used at that time, 30 years or so after Darwin's book came out, to excite the world about this idea of a common ancestry. 20 years later, the Piltdown man was used as additional evidence. And for 40 years, the American public was presented with this evidence to support the story of human evolution until it was exposed as a fraud. But the damage had been done, right? Because people had already been conditioned for 40 years to believe that this was true based on this fraudulent evidence. Another one was Nebraska Man, 1922. This turned out to be a single pig tooth or peccary tooth. And that was, so there was a single tooth. This was claimed to be a human tooth. It was later found to be a pig tooth, and it was retracted years later. But again, some damage had been done because this had been used to convince a willing public to accept this story. Peking Man was found in 1929, and in subsequent years, it was found with other humans, and these bones have been lost. Lucy's probably one of the most famous ones. This is 1974. These are the bones of Lucy. You can see that it's fairly incomplete, but there is enough evidence here to make some conclusions. As far as I can tell, there's missing hands and feet and most of the skull, but there's enough to draw some conclusions. And creationists have argued that these bones are actually more like a chimpanzee, and it's not bipedal at all. And so I think there's good reason to doubt the story that this was a human-like creature rather than just being an animal like a chimpanzee. And then Neanderthals is really interesting. So for years and years, Neanderthals were taught to be an early form of human, and that they were primitive and so forth. And then they found more and more evidence that they had human-like characteristics in terms of their behavior, things that were buried with them and so forth, tools and all that. And then when they started doing genetic analysis, they found that Neanderthals actually interbreeded with modern humans, and that something like 20% of the Neanderthal DNA is actually present in the modern human genome. So the definition of a species is organisms that can interbreed with one another. So the fact that Neanderthals interbreeded with modern humans, to me, seems like the obvious conclusion is that they were human. As far as I know, the scientific community has not given in on this. Neanderthals are still classified as a different species. I don't know exactly the reason why, but I don't think there's, I think it's inconsistent, right? And then there are many more examples. These are the historical examples. Many more bones and so forth have been found since then. As we looked at whale evolution, there's a lot of storytelling that goes on here. There's a lot of creative reconstruction, a lot of artistic license that's used. There's very, very little hard data. I did find one study by creationist Todd Wood, who has taken the exact same data that the evolutionists used to develop their tree, their historical tree, showing the branching of humans from these other ape-like creatures. And he took the exact same data they did, but he looked at it in a different way. And he said, okay, we have these different skulls, and we can measure more than 152 different things on those skulls, and then we can compare those measurements. We get this high dimensional data that we can then statistically analyze. And what I've shown here is a plot from his paper with a drawing that I added, that boundary in the middle. And the colorization is his, though, where he is then from this data concluding that there are some obvious clusters here. The clusters on the right seem to be very well separated from the data points on the left. And he says, and he argues that this is consistent with the idea that everything on the right side is actually human, everything on the left side is non-human. What you do not see here is you do not see a blurring between the two groups. You don't see a linear progression from one to the other over time. You don't see anything that supports a gradual progression as would be predicted by evolution. What you see here is discrete groups with a big boundary between them. This gap, this is sort of like the gap in the fossil record, right? That's always been there and always will be there because the evolutionary model is just wrong. Okay, so we've looked at, so this concludes the second part of the talk. We looked at the history, we looked at the fossil record briefly. And now what I want to do is spend the rest of our time talking about language. So languages, so over time, things evolve. So biological systems do evolve over time. That's known as lateral evolution. Things change. Similarly, languages evolve over time. but this is decreasing complexity. So just as the laws of genetics don't create more complexity, modern languages are similar. We generally don't have more complexity. Languages get simpler over time. So ancient Latin had 7 cases. A case is the different types of nouns, so like subject and object. It then got simplified to 6 cases. Modern English only has 3 cases. We all know that Chinese writing also has been simplified in the modern era to make it easier for people to use. So these are just 2 examples of many that languages generally get simpler over time. When we're thinking about language, we have to be clear to distinguish between spoken language and written language. And we'll talk about more about that. So the question is, what is the origin of language? If you ask secular scientists, they have lots of ideas, but there's really no agreement. They really don't have any story that they even propose for where language came from. So I would argue that language was actually a gift from God at creation to mankind. And then the question we want to ask is, could this original language have been Hebrew? Could this language that God gave mankind at creation, could it have been Hebrew? So here's the historical view of the church. Down to recent centuries, Hebrew as the original language and mother of all languages was a widely held view among intellectuals. So this is true up until the Enlightenment, right? The time when mankind started divorcing his thinking from the Bible, and then evolutionary thought came in and so forth. But Eupolemus, 150 BC, this is before Christ, says Moses was the first wise man. He gave grammar to the Jews, and then the Jews gave it to the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians gave it to the Greeks. So this is the history traced by Eupolemus. Clement says until then, like before the Tower of Babel, there was only one language, which is Hebrew. Jerome says the same thing. Jerome, who translated the Bible. Chrysostomus, an early church father, he says the same thing. We all know Augustine, and in his City of God, he talks about how the tribe of Heber alone, so Hebrew is where we get the word Hebrew from. So Heber didn't participate in the Tower of Babel, and so his family was spared from that judgment. And other people say the same thing. And the Venerable Bede, who's one of the earliest English writers that we have, he wrote the history of the English Church. He says the same thing. Dante, who wrote the Inferno, etc. And then Harvard College, the very first graduating class, had about 4 different theses. And one of those theses was Hebrew is the mother of tongues. There are lots of people I didn't list on here, just out of time, lack of time, from the 16 and 1700s. But Noah's original dictionary in 1828 does trace many English words back to their Semitic origin. But that's kind of been lost today. Paralleling the language side is the alphabet, and there's this book that's come out recently by Doug Petrovich, The World's Oldest Alphabet, and then there's a video, there's a documentary called Patterns of Evidence. So Tim Mahoney has put out 3 different documentaries. A 4th one is coming up. I highly recommend them. This is where I got a lot of my data from. They're very, very good, and they talk about, they try to reconcile what the secular scientists say is the truth with what the data actually says about the history of the Hebrew people and Moses and so forth. Okay, so here's our investigation. Could Adam and Eve talk? I think that's easy to answer. If so, what language did they speak? They had to speak some language. Is that language still around today? There's only 2 possibilities. Either it is or it isn't. Could they read or write? Again, 2 possibilities. And if they could read or write, was it based on pictograms or was it based on an alphabet? And is their writing system still around today? Again, 2 choices. Either their writing system, if it existed at all, either it's here or it's not here. And then what happened at the Tower of Babel? How did languages actually get scrambled at the Tower of Babel? How did they get confused? What happened to spoken language and what happened to written language? 2 different things. And then how did Moses write the Pentateuch? How did he write the first 5 books of the Bible? And in particularly Genesis, since he was not an eyewitness of Genesis. So these are questions that their investigation aims to address. And we are okay. So here's the thesis, and so here's what I'm advocating: that Adam and Eve could speak, they could read and write, they could do mathematics from creation. These are all part of the created order being good. These are all gifts from God. The written language was an alphabet, because an alphabet is far superior to pictograms, and this knowledge was passed down to Noah and beyond. At Babel, what God did was he confused the spoken language. So languages were all a scrambling of the original language. And then at that point, the spoken language got divorced from the written language. And at that point, everyone lost the ability to write, except for the remnant whose language was not scrambled. And so then people left without the ability to write. Some people some civilizations then developed pictograms for writing, so that you have the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and you have the cuneiform, and you have the Chinese, for example, who learned to write their language by using pictures, and so forth. But then others over time adapted the original alphabet. So like, for example, we use, well, we'll get to that in a minute. So this explains why other languages appear to have Hebrew roots. It also explains why Hebrew is the oldest alphabet. And it also explains why the Babylonians, who descended from Shem, this is where Abraham was from, obviously, why they excelled at mathematics. This is a separate topic. And it explains how Moses was able to write the Bible because he had a language at the time to write with. And it also explains how he wrote Genesis, I think. So this is somewhat speculative. But I want to just lay out where I'm coming from, so you can kind of fit the pieces into it. So here's our investigation. Could they talk? Oh, I wanted to skip this. So we already went through this. I had to delete that slide. Okay. So here's an example. When the natives arrived in Hawaii hundreds of years ago, they brought their native tongue with them, whatever that was. And eventually, languages do evolve over time. Eventually, that became what we consider Hawaiian today. It's spoken Hawaiian. In 1820, the American missionaries arrived, and some of the natives already knew some English because traders had been going through there. And so together with those natives, they invented an alphabet of 13 letters. They used the English letters that they'd already been applying to their own language to this new language that didn't have any form of writing. And they used those letters to write down what they heard. And they taught the Hawaiians to read and write. They translated the Bible into Hawaiian. They established schools and books. And the literacy rate went from 0% to over 90% in just a decade or so, which is pretty remarkable. And there's similar stories in other places, right? Where missionaries go to places where they don't have a form of writing. And the first thing they do is try to provide God's word to the people by giving them the ability to write. So this, I think, is consistent with the model I'm saying, which is that the ability to write was lost at the Tower of Babel for most people of the world. And since then, it's been pretty much a story of learning how to write again. So how would we test this hypothesis? Is there any evidence that Hebrew is the original language? First of all, from the spoken point of view, we can say that the etymology of all languages seems to point to Hebrew. That's what I'll try to argue. And then from writing, I think it's pretty conclusive that Hebrew is the original alphabet. So do all languages have a common origin? So the evolutionary viewpoint is that there's really no relationship between languages. But if you think about it, every language has sort of core words that are least likely to change over time. So for example, mama. And interesting, this is similar in most languages. So English, mother, Dutch and German, mutter, these are all very similar because these are closely related languages. Other languages that are less related are the Scandinavian languages, where again, they're very similar. They all have this mu sound to them. The Latin languages, which are less related, even less related, also have this mu sound to them. Even Chinese and other Asian languages have this mama kind of sound to them. And we can go down the list, even in Africa, and even the ancient languages of Sumerian and in Hebrew and so forth. They all have this M sound to them. So is this just a coincidence, or is this evidence that all languages have a common origin? So some principles when comparing two words in different languages is that only the consonants matter, because the original alphabet had no vowels, and some sounds are easily switched. So for example, the B to the P is easily switched. Those are what's called the voiced and the unvoiced. So you can't say "ba" without using your vocal cords, but you can say "p." So that's the difference in B and P. You can try this on your own and convince yourself. And so the D and the T get switched often because the D and the T, one's voiced, one's unvoiced, but they both involve touching the tongue to the teeth. And if you go down the line, the G and the K get swapped because they're both gutturals. They come from the back of the throat. And then H is not really a consonant. H is just a rough breathing. And so, if you apply these principles to say mother, motor, and mutter, you can see the similarity between these. MTR and MDR basically have the same root because D and T are easily switched. So this leads to the idea of Edenics, so the idea that there's an original language that's closely related to Hebrew, or it is Hebrew. And one example of that would be direct, which is the Hebrew word for way, road, distance, journey, or manner. So this has 3 letters in it, DR and K. And there are a number of English words that have similarity to this, like direct has that same sort of core 3 consonants to it. Direction, drag is like a drag strip where cars race. Trek is when you go on a trek or a journey. Truck is obviously a vehicle for taking you on a journey or on a road. Instructor is someone who tells you about the road of life. which way to go. A road. So sometimes another principle is that these letters can be swapped in the order. So road or root or rut also seem to have a common origin. And then, the right way to do things is to go down life along the correct path. And then we can look not just at English, but other languages. So in the word for road in Japanese, doro, is basically the same thing as the English road, but not switched. So it's more similar to the original direct. The word road in Korean just swaps to R and L, which is a very common swap in that part of the world. And then Turkish, Macedonian, Portuguese, Spanish, even Somali, these very unrelated languages all have this connection, it seems, right? So is this just coincidence, or is there something more to it? Another example would be after the Tower of Babel, languages were scrambled. People looked at an egg, and one person would look at the egg and say it's round, and so they would use something that borrows from the original word for round, and they would say egg. And then you have these other kind of nice coincidences too, like the hedgehog is an animal that curls itself into a round ball, and that word is strikingly similar to the Hebrew word for round. Another person would look at the egg and say, oh, it was laid by a chicken, and use the word off, which is the word for fowl, which is where in French we get the word luff, and the L is just an article. So it's really uff, and uff is almost exactly the same. In the Spanish huevo, so the F and the V get swapped, but you have the similarity. So this might all just be coincidence. This is what mainstream academics would say, is that this is all just coincidence and there's no science behind this at all. But the man who studied this has 40,000 examples or so of this. I find it compelling. Maybe you do too. So that's spoken language. And then the alphabet, we'll go through this real quickly. So the English alphabet, we know that 26 letters of the English alphabet comes from Latin. The Latin comes from Greek. The Greek comes from Phoenician. This is all established in the historical record. But you have these other ancient alphabets, the Arabic, the Nabatean, the Aramaic, the Hebrew, and so forth. What's interesting about all the ancient alphabets is they all start with the letter Aleph. The script looks different. You wouldn't think on the surface that these are related at all, but they're all called Aleph. The second letter is all called Beit. This is where the word Aleph Beit or alphabet comes from. And the third letter is Gimel, Dalet, Hey, so forth. So the names of the letters, there are 22 letters in every one of these alphabets. They're all called the exact same thing in the exact same order. Arabic has 6 letters added to the end later, but otherwise these are all identical. And if you look at the history of the alphabet, we're just going to rush through this. But all of these languages you can kind of trace the history of these languages back to this thing called proto-Sinaitic. So the question is, what is proto-Sinaitic? Again, all of the ones in yellow, they all have the exact same letters. Greek's the only one that adds the vowels. And this is consistent with this proto-Sinaitic, if you look at the timeline, is consistent with when Joseph ruled Egypt, according to that new chronology. So real quickly, this is Egypt. These are the places where that proto-Sinaitic has been found. It's been found in Egypt in a narrow 11-year window while Joseph ruled Egypt, and it contains distinctly Hebrew words with some names of biblical characters. This is all documented in that Tim Mahoney Patterns of Evidence documentary, which I highly recommend. After the Israelites left Egypt, they went to Canaan, and in Canaan, what shows up there, according to the historical record, historians have found Proto-Canaanite. Well, Proto-Canaanite's the same thing, and even in their minds, it's the same thing as Proto-Sinaitic, but it shows up later, and it shows up in Israel first, and then it shows up in Phoenicia. And the first place it shows up in Phoenicia is the sarcophagus of King Hiram. And if you remember the history of Israel, Solomon built the temple by coordinating with King Hiram of Phoenicia. So it's very logical that the Israelites would then share their alphabet with the Phoenicians, and that's where it came from. So why is this important? Scholars say that Moses originally said that Moses could not have written the Pentateuch. Why? Because there was no writing that was that old. And then they found old writing. And now they say that he couldn't have written it in Hebrew. Why? Because Hebrew is not that old. But in fact, Hebrew is the original alphabet, which I don't know if I've convinced you of, but there's lots of data. I've tried to at least kind of tease that idea out here. And there's more data that can be had in that documentary and so forth. And it appears, I think, that Hebrew is the oldest spoken language too. And so the idea is that if Adam and Eve could read and write, it would have been Hebrew, I think. And Moses, in writing Genesis, could have then have used potentially source material from Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Joseph and so forth, which would make Genesis the oldest book in the world. all the way back to creation. And that's all I have. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your time. Any questions? I know this is a lot of material and we kind of just fire hose rushed through it all, but did the best we could with the time we had. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, thank you for giving us the ability to reason, to think, giving us the ability to look at your word. Thank you that you didn't give us a blind faith. You didn't give us a faith that has no corroborating evidence, but you've actually blessed us, Lord, by giving us the ability to study the world around us and to understand it. Thank you most of all, Lord, for your word. Thank you for its truth. And we thank you, Lord, for this time we've had together. And we pray that you would bless our time and bless those in need, especially during this difficult time, that you would provide for them and give us compassion for the lost and for those in need. In Jesus' name, amen.
Before everybody goes,